What you want to know?
What's going on, people? Myke C-Town here with another episode of What Do You Want to Know, where you ask your questions. If I like your questions, I answer your questions on camera. Today's question comes from Jordan, and Jordan says, "G'day, Myke. I once heard Aussie rapper 360 say that his accent makes it hard for him to break into the American scene. Do you think that there's any validity to this, or do you think that this is just being used as an excuse? With rappers like Iggy Azalea having to change their accent in order to make any sort of waves in America, I can see why artists attribute the accent for their lack of crossover potential." So it's interesting that this question comes now, because very recently I said on Twitter that I can't get into hip hop from overseas because the accents throw me off. And this all came from a Twitter user asking why Dead End Hip Hop never reviews UK hip hop, which first off is untrue. We have reviewed UK hip hop. What I and other members of Dead End have said is that the accents throw us off. So yeah, that's really it. Now, immediately, hip-hop that is not in English does not interest me. That's not me saying that it's bad or it's whack or trash or anything like that. You know, you have to be very clear when you say things, because people interpret shit to their liking, so they have an excuse to make a counter argument. What I am saying is that listening to hip-hop, I want to hear the words that they're saying. You know, I'm a big fan of lyricism, even more than production in most cases. So if I have to stop and translate everything that the artist is saying, then it takes me out of the music. It's really as simple as that. As far as accents, yes, I do think that there is plenty of validity to what 360 said. To be fair, I could not find the quote that Jordan claims he made, but I'm going to assume that Jordan is correct there. A lot of Americans feel the same way I do about not getting into overseas rap, and I think that there's a couple of reasons for this. There's a thing called the Familiarity Principle, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You know, people will develop a preference for certain things due to the frequency of which they experience them. So if you grow up in the States and you hear mostly US hip hop, then you're going to develop a preference for that. Being that hip hop was born in the United States, then the majority of what we hear in the US is going to be US hip hop. It's just a natural thing. Now, once you get introduced to hip hop from overseas, either you like it or you don't. Is it possible that if you keep listening to it, eventually you get used to it? Of course. However, it's also possible that no matter how many times you hear it, you simply won't ever enjoy it. Another reason that some people don't care for overseas hip hop is they simply don't enjoy the aesthetics or the sonics of the songs. It may not even be about the familiarity of the accents or an understanding of the slang. It may simply be a situation of them not enjoying the way the rap vocals sound in a foreign accent. And that's kind of where I am. See, when I made the comment I mentioned earlier on Twitter, a couple of people that were arguing with me said that I didn't enjoy UK rap because I'm a product of classic American closed-mindedness towards other cultures. And yeah, I promise you, when I read that, I was like, okay, yeah, these jacknuts have never seen a single video that I've ever made. So let's quickly iron a few things out about myself. My favorite bands: The Cure and Current 93. Neither band is American. You can argue that Robert Smith doesn't have an accent when he sings. I disagree, but whose accent is stronger than David Tibet of Current 93? When you put on his music, his accent is unmistakably British. You could never claim that his music was from anywhere else. I also love Morrissey. Clear accent to me when he sings as well. The vast majority of the music that I show on my vinyl videos is metal from overseas, and it's metal a lot of times that isn't even in English. So the claim that me not liking foreign hip hop is due to me being closed off to non-American culture is a complete crock of shit. It's not a crock of shit for a lot of other Americans, but it definitely is for me personally. With some Americans, I definitely think there is a feeling of superiority over other countries and cultures. This weird sense of nationalism, it comes out even in how someone would enjoy music. Americans automatically think that they created everything, you know, even though that's not even close to being the truth. But some Americans have this kind of arrogance about them that immediately places US-based things at a higher priority or tier than things created elsewhere. And also because, you know, we're mostly accustomed to certain things here, we kind of look at things elsewhere as a sort of mimicry of what we have here. I remember when I was a really young kid, somewhere between elementary and middle school. I was living in California, and most of my friends were either Asian or Mexican because that was the demographic of the area that I lived in. And I remember trying to understand how language worked at a really young age. You know, sí means yes in Spanish, for example. And in my underdeveloped and uncultured brain, I would think, well, if you're just saying a word that means another word in English, then why don't you just say the English word? Of course, eventually I figured out that that was ignorant as fuck, but unfortunately a lot of people haven't gotten to that place yet, and they think of everything in those terms. If football is soccer, then why don't you just call it soccer? Then you have people who look at cultural things and immediately relate them to US ones. And if it doesn't compute to them, then it doesn't compare. So someone growing up in the hoods of Atlanta or Chicago or New York might hear about hoods in Britain or the racism in Australia and immediately dismiss the notion of these things being anywhere close to the magnitude that we have in the States. So when we think of a rapper talking about dealing drugs or gang wars in the UK or dealing with colorism in certain parts of Australia, we scoff because most of what we know about the UK is through media, and it's just queens and princes, tea and biscuits, which why don't you just call biscuits cookies, right? But yeah, most of what we know about Australians is either Crocodile Dundee or Steve Irwin. So these things don't compute because there hasn't been a lot of representation for them in the United States, so therefore we think they're not comparable. And it's also this weird thing of if overseas music takes too many cues from American music, then it's looked at as kind of second class or a lower tier, you know, but if it shows itself to be completely unique, then it's looked at as not real hip hop and therefore not worth listening to. But in some cases, I think that this is just another example of hearing things differently and enjoying things differently, and others having a very hard time accepting that, because it could also be how the culture of that particular region affects how the music is made, and therefore it removes the accessibility for some people. Take grime, for example. I love the production of that stuff, man. But I also like experimental hip hop. But your average rap fan, you know, the faster BPMs and the more fast-paced rhyming that a lot of those artists do could be quite off-putting. That's not immediately a distaste or a closed-minded approach to the culture. It could be just a simple preference. There's also a lot of slang terms that could be completely foreign to a lot of Americans. That doesn't bother me because I actually enjoy learning what foreign slang words mean, but words like safe and food and in it was confusing as fuck to me when I first heard UK rap, but either I figured it out on my own or I Googled it. Plus, watching shows like the UK version of Skins or Top Boy helped me out as well, but not all Americans are gonna do that. A lot of Americans are lazy, and again, that nationalism peeks its head in, and a lot of them simply don't care to figure this stuff out. And I know the question was more about Australian rap, but I haven't listened to any Australian rap, to be honest. But I would assume that Australians have slang words as well. So when you consider a song or an album that's full of these slang words that don't make any sense to the average lazy American, it's easy to understand why, to some people, these guys may as well be speaking a completely different language. There was also another guy who responded to my tweet, and he said, well then why can other cultures hear American rap and not be bothered by it? I can't say for certain because I've never asked any of them because I don't personally care. But if anything, I'd have to say it goes back to the familiarity principle. Even if someone is growing up overseas, if they're really into hip hop, then I would assume that most of the groups that they first heard were likely American hip hop groups. Hip hop is an American art form for the most part, so it's natural that most of the artists you'd hear due to the popularity would be from the US. But if I met someone from Nigeria and he said he didn't like American hip hop because he preferred to hear it in his own language, I'd say, okay, that totally makes sense. But the familiarity principle is also why I can listen to UK punk bands with no problem. Because when I was first getting into punk, you know, some of the earlier bands that I really got into were bands like Crass and the Subhumans and the Damned, you know, and the Addicts. So that was just what was natural to me. So hearing UK punk bands next to US punk bands, it wasn't jarring at all. when I first got into metal, the majority of what I was listening to was from overseas. So hearing a band like Dark Throne, who didn't always sing in English, right next to a band like Morbid Angel, again, it wasn't jarring. Mainly because with extreme metal, I always viewed the retched or the growled vocals to be like another instrument in the band. So what they were saying was never as important as how they were saying it or how it sounded when they said it. With hip hop, it was different. You know, one of the first overseas rappers that I ever got into was Dizzy Rascal, and I love his music despite the accent being different to me. I got big on the rapper Low Key as well. I still think he's incredibly dope. I also like rappers like Skepta and Kano, but I don't always have the desire to return to those artists because the accents throw me off, and even though I may like the music, I just enjoy US rap more. I can't speak for anyone but myself factually, because I know that a lot of the issue with Americans is not just due to the accents, but also due to the culture. A lot of Americans don't see past our own nose when it comes to other cultures, meaning we might see other places kind of for their exotic aesthetic beauty in terms of this would be a cool vacation spot, but we don't take the time to learn about those cultures or the people there because it just doesn't matter to us. Those sentiments carry on into how a lot of Americans view rap music. So in conclusion, to answer your question, I think a large reason that overseas hip hop doesn't break in the US is definitely in part the American superiority complex. It's also in part the unfamiliarity and therefore disinterest in the sound, and in part a lack of general enjoyment in the sound of the music. You can't force yourself to like something. I always liken this to food. You know, if you don't like Brussels sprouts, you can try to get them cooked in different ways to see if it makes a difference, but if you don't like the taste, you simply don't like the taste. The same goes for music. You know, you can try different flavors of that music from different areas, but you can't force yourself to enjoy something. And you know, you can force yourself to get more familiarized with it, but that's not quite the same thing. But one last point, let's be clear. Iggy Azalea absolutely did not have to change her accent from an Australian one to one that could be perceived as a southern black woman's accent. Sure, a lot of artists have changed their singing voices to resemble that of what would be considered a black person. Arguably Tom Waits, for example, even though I love his music. You could say Mick Jagger did the same thing to a degree. You could also say Adele if you want to throw that out there. But I don't think those things are quite as egregious as Iggy. And of course, I find it odd that she singled out that particular region of people and chose to emulate the vernacular of it. It comes across as a weird, subtle blackface example, especially given her weird comments about race that she's made over the past few years. I could go into detail about all of that, but I don't really want to, but I felt like I would be remiss if I did not at least address that one part of Jordan's question. So that's gonna do it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions that you would like me to answer, email them to ctownwdywk@gmail.com. And as usual, thank you for living, thank you for loving, thank you for being you, and I'll see you guys next time. All right, peace out, boy.